Before Rosa Parks became a symbol of resistance, there was a teenage girl who dared to do the unthinkable. At just 15 years old, Claudette Colvin refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. Her act of defiance came months before the world would hear Rosa Parks' name. But Claudette's courage didn't bring her fame. It brought fear, shame, and a silence that history nearly buried. Why was this young girl's bravery overlooked? And how did her forgotten rebellion quietly spark the flames of the civil rights movement? This is the untold story of a teenager who carried the weight of justice before the world was ready to see her. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment with your city. I'd love to know where you're watching from. In the spring of 1955, Montgomery, Alabama was a city defined by invisible lines. Lines that told black residents where they could live, where they could eat, and most notably, where they could sit. Every bus that roamed the streets carried the weight of segregation, a cruel system that reserved the front rows for white passengers and pushed black passengers to the back, no matter how full the bus became. The rules were not just laws. They were shackles, meant to humiliate and remind every black man, woman, and child that they were less than. For 15-year-old Claudette Colvin, those lines were everywhere. She was a bright, determined girl with dreams larger than the small neighborhood she grew up in. Claudette loved school, especially history. She admired figures like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, women who had stood up against impossible odds. To her, they weren't just names in textbooks. They were living proof that courage could alter the course of history. Yet, even as she studied their bravery, Claudette couldn't escape the reality of her own world, where every day was shaped by oppression. Claudette's life was not easy. She grew up in a poor family, raised by her mother and stepfather, both of whom worked tirelessly to put food on the table. Their home was modest, but it was filled with love, faith, and a determination to survive despite the heavy weight of segregation. Claudette was known for her sharp mind and strong will. Teachers described her as brilliant, though sometimes stubborn. She absorbed lessons quickly, particularly when they touched on freedom, equality, and the fight against injustice. At school, she was surrounded by friends who, like her, dreamed of a different life, a world where they could walk freely into any store, drink from any fountain, and sit wherever they wanted on the bus. But every day reminded them of the cruel boundaries. Black children walked miles to attend underfunded schools, while buses carrying white children passed them by. They sat in classrooms with broken desks and outdated books. The unfairness was not just visible, it was unavoidable, and yet Claudette held on to something powerful, a restless fire that told her things could change. She may have been young, but her heart beat with the rhythm of defiance. She had been taught about her constitutional rights, and she knew, deep inside, that segregation was not just unfair, it was illegal. She believed in her right to be treated as equal. That belief would soon lead her into history. The day of her quiet rebellion began like any other. It was March 2nd, 1955. The air was thick with the scent of spring, and Claudette, dressed in her school uniform, climbed aboard a Montgomery City bus after school. She dropped her fare into the box, then walked down the aisle to find a seat in the section designated for black passengers. The bus filled quickly. Passengers pressed against each other, the hum of the engine drowning out the quiet conversations of weary workers heading home. Claudette slid into her seat near the middle, tired but content. She carried her school books tightly, as though they were shields. Every lesson, every page, reminded her that knowledge was her way forward. That afternoon she was thinking about Sojourner Truth's famous words, "Ain't I a woman?" Claudette had just written an essay about black heroes for her history class, and her mind was alive with thoughts of freedom and dignity. The bus rolled on, picking up more passengers. Soon, the seats in the front, reserved for white passengers, were full. A white woman climbed aboard, and the driver looked into the mirror, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the bus. He called back, ordering the black passengers sitting near the dividing line to move. This was the rule. Even if the black section had empty seats, if a white passenger needed one, black riders were expected to surrender their place. Claudette sat frozen. Her friends beside her reluctantly stood and shuffled toward the back. But Claudette did not move. Something inside her tightened, an unshakable refusal. The words of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth echoed in her mind. She thought of her classmates, her family, and the generations who had endured humiliation without fighting back. She thought of the Constitution she studied in class, the promises of justice that had been denied to people who looked like her. The driver barked at her again, louder this time, his voice sharp with anger. Other passengers turned their heads, watching in silence, holding their breath. But Claudette's body refused to obey. She gripped her books tighter, her knuckles white with resolve. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady. She would not move. For a 15-year-old girl in Montgomery, this was not just defiance. It was danger. Black passengers who resisted faced arrest, violence, or worse. Claudette knew the risks, but in that moment, fear did not control her. She was tired, not just physically but emotionally, tired of being treated as invisible, tired of shrinking herself to make others comfortable. The driver, furious, stopped the bus and called the police. Claudette sat there, trembling but unyielding as two white officers boarded. The atmosphere grew heavier with each step they took. The officers loomed over her, demanding she move. Claudette looked up at them, eyes burning with a mix of fear and courage, and still she refused. The officers dragged her from her seat. She clutched her books to her chest as though they were armor, the pages pressing against her heart. The bus fell into a suffocating silence. No one dared to intervene. As Claudette was pulled out into the street, her dignity intact, but her body shaking, she became more than a teenage girl. She became a spark. Her arrest shocked her classmates, her teachers, and her community. A 15-year-old had done what many adults were too afraid to do. She had openly defied the system. For her bravery, she was thrown into a police car, handcuffed like a criminal. In the back seat, she cried, not because she regretted her decision, but because she knew her life would never be the same. When news spread of her arrest, people in the community felt a strange mix of pride and fear. On one hand, Claudette's defiance inspired them. On the other, it terrified them. What would happen to this girl? What would happen to anyone else who dared to follow her example? Civil rights leaders in Montgomery noticed Claudette's case. The NAACP, including a young Rosa Parks, saw the significance of her courage. But they also hesitated. Claudette was so young. She came from a working-class family. And soon after her arrest, she discovered she was pregnant, which, at the time, meant that leaders believed she would not be seen as a suitable face of the movement. Instead of being celebrated, Claudette was quietly pushed aside. She returned to school, her classmates whispering behind her back, her community unsure whether to honor or avoid her. The world was not ready to lift her up, and yet her stand was the first crack in the walls of Montgomery's segregation. Months later, Rosa Parks would refuse to give up her seat, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott and igniting a movement that changed the nation. History would remember Parks's name, but it almost forgot Claudette's. And yet, Claudette Colvin's story is not just about being forgotten. It's about the quiet, painful bravery of a teenager who risked everything before the cameras arrived. Her setup was not just a bus ride, it was the beginning of a storm. When Claudette Colvin sat handcuffed in the back of that police car, staring at the blurred streets of Montgomery through tear-streaked eyes, she didn't yet understand the weight of what she had done. To her, it had been a matter of dignity, an instinctive refusal to let herself be pushed down once more. But to the city, to the community, and to the system built on centuries of oppression, her act was nothing short of rebellion. The ride to the police station felt endless. The officers spoke about her like she was less than human, laughing as if dragging a 15-year-old girl off a bus was entertainment. Every insult was a knife, but Claudette sat stiff, clutching her books tightly. They could bruise her body, but they couldn't touch her resolve. At the station, she was booked, fingerprinted, and charged with violating segregation laws, disturbing the peace, and assaulting police officers. A cruel exaggeration meant to make her look dangerous. Claudette stood in that cold room, dwarfed by grown men in uniform, her heart racing. But even in fear, she refused to beg. She knew that if she apologized, if she said she was wrong, the system would win. Word of her arrest spread quickly. Her mother, overwhelmed with worry, rushed to the station, praying her daughter wouldn't be harmed. Their pastor and members of the community came too, shocked at the bravery Claudette had shown. But beneath their admiration was hesitation. Montgomery was a dangerous place for black people who challenged the rules. Speaking out too loudly could cost you your job, your home, even your life. Claudette was eventually released into her mother's care, but her reputation was forever changed. The next day at school, whispers followed her through the halls. Some classmates admired her courage, calling her brave. Others warned her she had stirred up trouble that could bring consequences for them all. Teachers were cautious around her, some proud but others nervous, as though even acknowledging her bravery might draw unwanted attention. But Claudette refused to shrink. She walked with her head held high, even as her community wrestled with mixed feelings about her defiance. For the leaders of Montgomery's civil rights movement, Claudette's action was both inspiring and complicated. Members of the NAACP, including Rosa Parks, E.D. Nixon, and lawyer Fred Gray, saw in her a symbol of resistance. Here was a young girl who had exposed the cruelty of segregation in the rawest form. But she was only 15, and soon she would face another challenge, a pregnancy out of wedlock, which in 1955 carried immense stigma. To the movement's strategists, Claudette's personal circumstances made her an easy target for critics. They feared the opposition would discredit her, using her youth and her private life to dismiss the cause. So Claudette's story was quietly buried. Instead of being held up as the face of the movement, she was sidelined. Civil rights leaders continued to fight, waiting for the right figure to embody their struggle, and that figure would eventually be Rosa Parks. But in those months after her arrest, Claudette bore the weight of her defiance alone. She returned home each day to the same small house, helping her mother with chores, doing her homework by lamplight, and dreaming of freedom. But every bus ride, every trip through Montgomery's segregated streets, reminded her of her place in the eyes of the law. She had stood up once, but the system had quickly reminded her of its power. The trial came swiftly. Claudette and her family stood in court, surrounded by white faces that looked at her with contempt. The judge listened to the charges, the police officers repeating their version of events. Claudette's defense argued that she had simply exercised her constitutional rights, but the verdict was predictable. She was found guilty of violating segregation laws and resisting arrest. The assault charge was eventually dropped, but the conviction still carried shame and consequence. For Claudette, it wasn't just about legal punishment. It was about reputation. She was now marked as a troublemaker, a criminal in the eyes of Montgomery's white community. Jobs would be harder to find, opportunities would shrink. And yet, even as the system tried to break her, Claudette's resolve deepened. She told herself that one day, people would understand what she had done and why. At home, her mother worried. She loved her daughter fiercely but feared for her safety. The world was not kind to black girls who stepped out of line. Claudette's mother urged her to be cautious, to keep her head down. But Claudette could not forget the fire that burned inside her the day she refused to move. Meanwhile, Montgomery simmered. Beneath the surface, discontent was growing. Black residents were tired of paying fares to ride buses that treated them like second-class citizens. Claudette's act had exposed the injustice clearly, but it hadn't sparked a mass uprising. The city needed a figure who could unite everyone, a face the community could rally behind. That moment came on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks, a respected seamstress and NAACP secretary, refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. Like Claudette, she was arrested. But unlike Claudette, Rosa Parks was an adult, with a reputation that made her an ideal symbol for the movement. Her defiance was carefully chosen, strategically positioned, and immediately embraced. The Montgomery bus boycott was born. For over a year, black residents refused to ride the buses, crippling the transit system financially and drawing national attention. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. rose to prominence, and eventually, the Supreme Court declared bus segregation unconstitutional. History was made. The civil rights movement surged forward, and Claudette Colvin watched from the sidelines. It was bittersweet. On one hand, she felt pride. The change she had longed for was finally happening, the buses slowly breaking down their barriers. But deep inside, she also felt the sting of being forgotten. She had been the first. Months before Rosa Parks, she had risked everything. And yet the world seemed determined to erase her. Her classmates teased her. Adults whispered. Her name was left out of headlines. Claudette lived in the shadow of a movement she had helped ignite. For a teenager who had stood so bravely against injustice, being erased was its own form of cruelty. And yet, Claudette refused to let her spirit die. She kept fighting in quiet ways. Years later, she became one of 4 plaintiffs in the landmark case Browder vs. Gale, which ultimately ended bus segregation in Montgomery. Her testimony, her courage, and her persistence were instrumental, even if the spotlight never found her. But in the rising action of her life, the weight was heavy. Claudette's story shows the painful truth about history. Sometimes the bravest are silenced, not because they lacked courage, but because the world wasn't ready to honor them. For Claudette, the years following her arrest were filled with both hope and heartbreak. She dreamed of becoming a lawyer, of continuing the fight for justice. But her path was riddled with obstacles, poverty, stigma, and the trauma of being overlooked. She eventually moved to New York, where she worked as a nurse's aide, raising her family in quiet dignity. And yet, even in the shadows, her legacy endured. Though her name was nearly erased, her act of defiance became the unspoken foundation of a movement that reshaped America. The rising action of Claudette's story is not just about what she endured. It's about the tension between courage and recognition, about how history can choose its heroes, often leaving others behind, about how the fight for justice is never clean, never fair, and never without sacrifice. And as the buses in Montgomery slowly began to change, as the boycott brought segregation crashing down, Claudette Colvin, the teenager who had dared to say no, was left with one haunting question. Would the world ever remember her? Years passed. Montgomery moved on. The boycott ended, the buses were desegregated, and Rosa Parks' name was etched into history books as the mother of the civil rights movement. Children in classrooms across America learned her story. Politicians praised her. Streets were named in her honor. But in the shadows of New York City, working long shifts as a nurse's aide, Claudette Colvin watched history unfold with a bitter ache in her chest. She knew the truth. 9 months before Rosa Parks, she had already taken that stand. She had already sat in that seat. She had already been dragged off the bus in handcuffs, trembling but unbroken. And yet, no one spoke her name. The silence was deafening. When she told her children what she had done, even they looked at her with surprise. "Mama, why isn't your name in the books? Why don't people talk about you?" Claudette struggled for words. How could she explain that history had chosen another face? How could she tell them that even within a movement for freedom, she had been deemed the wrong kind of hero? The climax of Claudette's story is not a single dramatic event. It is the slow, grinding realization that the world had erased her. That the fire she had ignited was carried forward by others, while her own flame was dimmed deliberately. In Montgomery, Rosa Parks became the perfect symbol. She was an adult, a respected seamstress, soft-spoken and poised. Claudette, in contrast, was a teenager, fiery, emotional, and later a young mother out of wedlock. For movement leaders strategizing against a brutal system, image mattered. They believed Claudette's circumstances could weaken the cause, give segregationists ammunition. So they hid her story, but hiding her story came at a cost. For Claudette, the cost was invisibility. Each year that passed, each book written about the civil rights movement, each award given to others, it deepened the wound. She lived with the knowledge that she had given so much, risked so much, only to be forgotten. Yet the truth could not stay buried forever. In the 1970s and 1980s, historians began digging deeper into Montgomery's history. They stumbled upon Claudette's name. They found court documents. They uncovered testimonies. Slowly, whispers grew into questions. Who was Claudette Colvin? Why was her story left out? For Claudette, hearing her name spoken again after so many years felt surreal. Journalists called, historians wrote articles, and students asked to interview her. Each time she told her story, the memories came rushing back. The bus, the police, the trial, the humiliation, the fight. But with every retelling, her voice trembled with both pride and pain. Pride because she knew what she had done mattered. Pain because she knew she had been denied the recognition she deserved in her youth, when it could have lifted her up instead of leaving her in the shadows. The climax of Claudette's journey comes in the cruel contrast between truth and memory. Truth, she was the first. Memory, she was erased. Imagine being a woman in your 60s, hearing school children across the country honor Rosa Parks, while you, who had risked everything at 15, remained unknown. Imagine working quietly in the Bronx, changing bedpans and caring for patients, while knowing that your courage had changed history. But the world refused to say your name. This was Claudette's reality. And yet, she never lashed out at Rosa Parks. She never spoke with bitterness toward the woman who became the face of the movement. Claudette understood that Rosa was chosen strategically. She understood the movement's decision, even if it broke her heart. Her fight was not with Rosa. It was with the injustice of being silenced. Her story finally burst back into public view when she revealed she had been one of the plaintiffs in Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court case that declared bus segregation unconstitutional. History books had celebrated the boycott, Martin Luther King Jr., and Rosa Parks, but rarely mentioned that it was Claudette's name, along with 3 other women, etched in the legal case that changed America. For Claudette, this revelation was vindication, proof that she had not only been a spark, but a pillar of the movement. Proof that without her, the buses of Montgomery might never have been desegregated, but the vindication was bittersweet. Recognition came too late, decades after her sacrifice, long after her youth had passed, long after the moment when she needed her community to stand by her. The climax of Claudette Colvin's life story is not a triumphant parade. It is the quiet, devastating realization that courage does not always guarantee recognition. That history can be cruel in who it chooses to remember. Still, in those moments of rediscovery, as journalists wrote her name again, as students honored her in classrooms, Claudette found a sliver of peace. She had lived her life in the shadows, but the truth was surfacing. She had not been erased completely. Her name began to appear in documentaries. Authors wrote books about her. Schools invited her to speak. Young black girls looked at her with awe, finally seeing the hidden hero who had walked so bravely before them. And in that moment, decades after she first sat down on that bus, Claudette Colvin finally felt the weight of her legacy. Not in fame, not in fortune, but in the quiet acknowledgement that history could no longer ignore her. This was the climax, the painful but undeniable confrontation between the truth of her bravery and the world's attempt to bury it. A confrontation that forced America to reckon with not only the cruelty of segregation, but the cruelty of forgetting its own heroes. Claudette Colvin never became the symbol of the civil rights movement that Rosa Parks later embodied. Instead, she lived much of her life in the shadows, away from the spotlight. But as history would eventually reveal, her role in that fight for justice was not erased. It was simply waiting to be rediscovered. After her arrest at just 15, Claudette was left carrying the emotional weight of rejection. She watched as her act of courage, the refusal to give up her seat to a white passenger, was overshadowed by the more suitable face of the movement, Rosa Parks. While Parks became a name known worldwide, Claudette was pushed aside, her youth, poverty, and pregnancy making her an imperfect candidate in the eyes of those leading the campaign. The world moved on, but Claudette's pain lingered. She struggled with feelings of invisibility, as if her bravery had been swallowed by history. Yet despite this, she refused to allow bitterness to consume her. Instead, she found purpose in her quiet resilience, raising her children and continuing her life as best she could. She worked as a nurse's aide in New York for decades, caring for the sick, showing compassion, and living in humility, while few knew the role she had played in changing the course of American history. But history, as it often does, began to look back. Scholars and journalists started digging into the untold stories of the civil rights movement. And there, in the margins of forgotten records, Claudette Colvin's name appeared. Slowly, her story resurfaced. People were astonished to learn that before Rosa Parks, there was Claudette, a teenager whose defiance cracked open the walls of segregation. Recognition came late, but it came nonetheless. Claudette was honored in courtrooms, schools, and documentaries. She received standing ovations when her name was finally spoken on platforms that once ignored her. She was awarded plaques and tributes, and students across the country began learning her story alongside that of Rosa Parks. And yet, when asked about it, Claudette often reminded people, "I was just a teenager who was tired of giving in." Her words stripped away the grandeur of history and brought it back to something deeply human. The courage of a young girl who acted not for fame, not for recognition, but simply because she knew in her heart it was right. The impact of Claudette's forgotten stand rippled outward. By refusing to move that day in 1955, she set in motion a chain of events that would build momentum for the Montgomery bus boycott and the larger civil rights movement. Though she wasn't celebrated at the time, her bravery laid the foundation for Rosa Parks and countless others to follow. Without her, the timeline of change might have looked very different. But perhaps her greatest impact was not on history books or legal records. It was on the generations who came after her. Young black girls and boys, once taught only about Rosa Parks, began to learn about Claudette Colvin too. They saw that heroes come in many forms, that courage doesn't always look polished, and that justice often starts with ordinary people who choose to act, no matter the cost. Claudette's story revealed something essential, that history is not only shaped by those who are remembered, but also by those who are forgotten. Behind every headline, every celebrated leader, are countless unnamed individuals whose choices carved the path to freedom. Claudette represented them all. As she grew older, Claudette reflected on her life with a mixture of pride and pain. She acknowledged the hardship of being cast aside, but also embraced the truth that her stand mattered, even if the world had taken decades to admit it. Her legacy endures not in statues or monuments, but in the voices of young people who whisper her name, in classrooms where her courage is finally taught, and in the unshakable reminder that bravery knows no age. In the end, Claudette Colvin's life teaches us this: change is rarely convenient, often uncomfortable, and sometimes costly. But it is always possible when someone dares to say no to injustice. She may not have been celebrated in her time, but history has corrected itself. Claudette Colvin, the teenager who refused to give up her seat, remains a symbol of raw, unpolished, unrelenting courage. A reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are not the ones we see on posters or in headlines, but the ones who act quietly, with no audience, no recognition, and no promise of reward. Because of Claudette, the fight for justice found its spark. And because of her, generations will know that even the smallest voice, even the youngest soul, has the power to move the world.